Power has always been a strange and elusive thing, especially in the ancient world, where a single ruler's decision could alter the fate of millions, yet their true motives often vanished into the shadows of time. Think about it. How many kings and queens have been forgotten entirely, their names erased by the centuries, and how many more left behind legacies so puzzling that we're still piecing them together today? This is the realm of the mysterious monarch, where history and legend collide, where crowns were worn by figures who seemed to bend reality itself. These weren't just rulers, they were forces of nature, their lives woven with secrets that even now, thousands of years later, refuse to be fully understood. Take a step into their world and you'll find thrones built on riddles. Some of these sovereigns vanished without a trace, their reigns ending in whispers. Others wielded power so unconventionally that their own people questioned whether they were divine or mad. There were pharaohs who defied tradition, emperors who ruled from the shadows, and queens whose strategies were so brilliant or so brutal that their enemies could only guess at their next move. These weren't just political leaders, they were architects of the extraordinary, shaping kingdoms with choices that still leave historians scratching their heads. What drove them? What secrets did they take to their graves? And why do their stories linger in the collective imagination, haunting us like unfinished puzzles? That's the journey we're beginning today, a voyage through the lives of 20 monarchs who didn't just rule their kingdoms, they rewrote the rules entirely. From the deserts of Egypt to the palaces of forgotten empires, we'll uncover the enigmas that defined their reigns. Some of these rulers were geniuses, others tyrants, and a few may have been something beyond our understanding entirely. But one thing unites them: their legacies are anything but simple. So settle in, because history is about to get a lot more intriguing. By the time we're done, you'll see ancient power in a whole new light. And trust me, some of these stories are so astonishing, they'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. The truth, it's stranger than any legend, and it's waiting for us just ahead. The first monarch on our journey is a ruler so controversial that his own people tried to wipe him from existence. Meet Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who dared to dismantle Egypt's gods. Picture this: a land where thousands of deities had been worshipped for centuries, where temples thrived, and rituals were as constant as the Nile's floods. Then, suddenly, a king arrives who declares all those gods obsolete, replacing them with a single divine presence, the radiant sun disk, Aten. Overnight, Egypt's spiritual landscape shattered. Statues of Ammon were toppled, temples abandoned, and priests left powerless. But why? What could drive a pharaoh to upend the very foundation of his civilization? Akhenaten didn't just change religion, he rewrote reality. He built an entirely new capital, Amarna, far from the old centers of power, as if to sever ties with the past. The city rose from the desert like a mirage, its open-air temples bathed in sunlight, a deliberate rejection of the shadowy sanctuaries of old. Art transformed too, gone were the idealized portraits of pharaohs. Instead, Akhenaten demanded surreal, almost alien depictions, elongated faces, sagging bellies, intimate family scenes bathed in Aten's rays. Was this madness? Divine inspiration, or a political masterstroke to break the priesthood's grip on Egypt's wealth? Yet, as quickly as he rose, Akhenaten fell. His death triggered a frenzy of erasure. Statues were smashed, his name chiseled from monuments, his city left to crumble into the sands. Later pharaohs branded him a criminal, a mistake to be forgotten. But here's the twist: his revolution may have outlasted him. Some scholars whisper that the echoes of monotheism in later religions trace back to Amarna's sun-drenched heresy. So was Akhenaten a visionary or a tyrant, a prophet or a fool? The desert still holds its silence, but one thing's certain: no ruler before or after dared to reshape an entire civilization so utterly, or paid such a price for it. And if you think that's mysterious, just wait, because our next monarch didn't just defy tradition. They vanished without a trace, leaving behind a throne and a mystery that has tormented historians for centuries. From the sands of Egypt, we journey now to a legend so enduring that it transcends borders, religions, and even time itself: the enigma of the Queen of Sheba. Unlike Akhenaten, whose reign left physical ruins to ponder, Sheba's legacy is woven entirely from whispers. No tomb, no palace, not a single undisputed artifact bears her name. And yet, her story has captivated the world for millennia. Imagine a ruler whose wealth was so vast that her caravan to Jerusalem included camels laden with gold, spices, and precious stones, gifts so extravagant they stunned even King Solomon, the wisest and richest monarch of his age. But who was she? A diplomat, a conqueror, or perhaps something even more extraordinary? A woman who walked into the halls of power and rewrote the rules of influence itself. The mystery begins with geography. Three ancient cultures, Ethiopian, Jewish, and Islamic, claim her as their own, yet none can definitively place her kingdom. Was she Bilqis, the sun-worshipping Queen of Sheba in modern-day Yemen, whose people controlled the frankincense trade? Or was she Makta, the Ethiopian sovereign whose lineage, according to tradition, founded an imperial dynasty that lasted centuries? The land of Sheba itself has never been found, leaving historians to piece together clues from fragmented texts. The Bible describes her as a seeker of wisdom, the Quran as a ruler who submitted to divine truth, and Ethiopian law paints her as the mother of a nation. How could one woman wear so many crowns in the imaginations of so many peoples? Then there's the great unanswered question: why did she travel to Jerusalem? Was it truly, as scripture suggests, to test Solomon's famed judgment with riddles? Or was this a strategic masterstroke, an alliance forged not through war but through intellect and trade? Some scholars speculate she came to negotiate access to vital trade routes, leveraging her kingdom's monopoly on spices and perfumes. Others suggest her visit was a spiritual pilgrimage, a quest for knowledge that would reshape her reign. The ancient world rarely recorded the motives of women in power, but Sheba's story refuses to be silenced. Even the air between her and Solomon crackles with ambiguity. Was their exchange a meeting of minds, a political chess game, or the beginning of a love story that would birth a lineage of emperors? The silence of archaeology only deepens the intrigue. No inscription definitively confirms her reign, no ruins bear her seal, and yet, in Ethiopia, emperors traced their bloodline to her son Menelik for nearly 3,000 years. In Yemen, oral traditions still speak of a queen who built marvels with stone, and in Jerusalem, the echo of her questions to Solomon lingers in sacred texts. Perhaps that's the true power of Sheba's mystery. She exists in the space between history and myth, a mirror to every culture that cherishes her. A ruler without borders, a queen without a tomb. Her legacy isn't carved in stone, but in the stories we can't stop telling. And speaking of stories that defy explanation, our next monarch didn't just vanish from records, they orchestrated their own disappearance, leaving behind a throne and a legend that still taunts historians today. History remembers Nero as the emperor who played his lyre while Rome burned, but what if that's not the whole story? Few rulers have been as polarizing as Rome's fifth emperor, a man whose name became synonymous with decadence and cruelty, yet whose reign was far more complex than the caricature suggests. Imagine a young ruler ascending to power at just 16, inheriting an empire already simmering with intrigue. Nero began with promise. He lowered taxes, funded public games, and championed Greek culture, earning adoration from the common people. But beneath the surface, tensions festered. His mother, Agrippina, had schemed ruthlessly to secure his throne, only to become the first casualty of his paranoia. Was her death the act of a monster, or the desperate move of a boy drowning in the shadows of his predecessors? Then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, the catastrophe that would define Nero's legacy. Flames consumed the city for 6 days, leaving rubble where temples and homes once stood. Ancient historians like Tacitus claim Nero sang atop his palace while the city burned, a story so damning it's echoed for centuries. But here's the twist: Tacitus himself admits he wasn't there. Some accounts suggest Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started, and when he returned, he opened his palaces to the homeless and organized relief efforts. So why the vilification? Perhaps because of what came next, his decision to rebuild Rome with wider streets and fireproof stone, a project requiring vast funds. To fill the treasury, he targeted a convenient scapegoat, the Christians, then a small, misunderstood sect. Their brutal persecution became the dark stain on his reign. But was this pragmatic cruelty or genuine fanaticism? Nero's contradictions only deepen when you examine his passions. He didn't just enjoy the arts, he performed publicly, composing poetry and racing chariots, acts considered scandalous for an emperor. To the aristocracy, this was madness. To the masses, it made him relatable. His love for Greek culture reshaped Roman aesthetics, yet his extravagance drained the treasury. When revolts erupted in Gaul and Spain, the Senate declared him an enemy of the state. Facing execution, Nero allegedly whispered, "What an artist dies in me," before taking his own life. But even death didn't end his story. For years, rumors persisted that he'd survived, hiding in the East. 3 impostors claimed his identity, each gaining enough followers to unsettle emperors. So who was the real Nero? A tyrant who reveled in destruction, or a visionary crushed by the weight of a system he couldn't control? The answer may lie in the silence between the lines. Ancient historians wrote under emperors who benefited from painting Nero as a monster. His populist reforms threatened the elite, his artistic pursuits defied tradition, and his downfall became a cautionary tale. But in the ashes of his reign, Rome rebuilt itself stronger, an irony he never lived to see. And if you think Nero's contradictions are baffling, wait until you hear about the next monarch, a ruler whose very existence was doubted for centuries, until a single discovery turned legend into startling reality. The ground trembled as 10,000 warriors roared their allegiance, not to a king, but to a queen draped in a tartan cloak, her hair like fire against the smoke-filled sky. This was Boudica, the warrior who turned grief into an uprising that shook Rome to its core. Picture Britain in the year 60 AD, a land freshly conquered by the empire's legions. The Romans thought the Celts were broken, their spirit crushed beneath the weight of sandals and swords, but they hadn't counted on the fury of a wronged mother. When Roman soldiers flogged Boudica and violated her daughters, they didn't just attack a family, they ignited a rebellion that would burn its way into history. What followed was a campaign of vengeance so ferocious it still chills the blood. Boudica united fractured tribes under a single banner, her speeches weaving rage and pride into a weapon as sharp as any blade. She marched on Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, where retired Roman soldiers had built their homes atop sacred Celtic land. The city fell in flames, its temples reduced to ash. Next came Londinium, the bustling trade hub. By the time Boudica's forces finished, the streets were littered with Roman corpses, their their heads mounted on spikes. Even Suetonius Paulinus, Rome's most ruthless general, hesitated when he saw the destruction. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the mighty empire might be driven from Britain's shores. Yet empires don't fall so easily. In the final battle, Boudica's forces outnumbered the Romans nearly 10-1, but discipline triumphed over sheer numbers. The Celts, fueled by passion, charged headlong into a killing zone of tight Roman formations and precision volleys. By dusk, 80,000 Celts lay dead, their queen's fate as murky as the marshland mist. Did she swallow poison to evade capture, as Tacitus claims, or did she vanish into the wilderness, her legend growing with each whispered tale of her escape? The Romans, eager to erase her, never found her body. Today, somewhere beneath the fields of England, the earth keeps her secrets along with the location of her lost grave, a mystery that's tantalized archaeologists for centuries. But Boudica's legacy outlasted Rome itself. To the Victorians, she became a symbol of British resilience. To modern feminists, an icon of female defiance. Even the name we know her by is a puzzle. Was she truly Boudica, or did Roman scribes mishear the Celtic Boudica, meaning victory? Perhaps it doesn't matter. What endures is the image of a queen who looked an empire in the eye and refused to blink, proving that even in defeat, some spirits can't be conquered. And if you think that's the last of history's warrior queens, prepare to meet a ruler whose legend blurs the line between hero and demon. A monarch who didn't just fight empires but built one from the ashes of her enemies. Legends whisper of a man who walked into Sparta with nothing but a vision and left behind a society that would terrify the ancient world. Lycurgus, the phantom lawgiver, is the ghost at the heart of Sparta's brutal machine. Historians can't even agree if he was flesh and blood or a myth conjured to explain the unthinkable, a civilization built entirely for war. Imagine a kingdom where children were bathed in wine to test their strength, where boys were starved to teach them to steal, and where weakness was the only unforgivable crime. This was Lycurgus's Sparta, if he ever existed at all. The mystery begins with the gaps. Unlike other ancient reformers, Lycurgus left no writings, no tomb, not even a reliable birth date. Herodotus, the father of history, called him a man of divine wisdom, while Plato speculated he might have been a god in disguise. Even Plutarch, who wrote his biography centuries later, admitted his sources were shrouded in fable. So why does his shadow loom so large? Because the system attributed to him worked with terrifying efficiency. Sparta's entire social order, the communal mess halls, the iron currency designed to discourage wealth, the infamous agoge training that turned boys into lethal weapons, was said to be his creation. But here's the twist: these weren't just laws, they were a total reinvention of human nature. Take the Crypteia, Sparta's secret police. Each year, elite young men were sent into the countryside with daggers and a single mission: slaughter helots, the enslaved population, to keep them in constant terror. Was this Lycurgus's doing, or did later Spartans invoke his name to justify their atrocities? The line between reverence and propaganda blurs. Even Sparta's most shocking traditions, like discarding sickly infants at Mount Taygetus, were defended as Lycurgan wisdom. But archaeology tells a stranger story. Excavations reveal Spartan art before the supposed reforms showed vibrant colors and luxury, nothing like the austere warrior culture that followed. Did one man truly erase an entire way of life? Perhaps the most haunting clue lies in Lycurgus's disappearance. Ancient accounts claim he made Sparta swear to uphold his laws until he returned, then vanished forever, ensuring no one could undo his work. It's the perfect allegory, a founder who becomes more powerful as a myth than he ever could as a man, and it raises a chilling question. Did Sparta's relentless war machine need a mortal architect, or was it easier to believe a god had ordained their suffering? The truth may lie in the middle. Lycurgus could have been a real reformer whose deeds were amplified into legend, a convenient figurehead for a society that outgrew him. Or perhaps, as some modern scholars suggest, he was never more than a story Sparta told itself, a ghostly mirror held up to reflect the darkness at its core. Either way, his legacy is written in the bones of the warriors he shaped, men who stood at Thermopylae and laughed in the face of death. For better or worse, the Phantom King built a people who feared neither pain nor oblivion. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying reform of all. Now, let's turn to a ruler whose existence was never in doubt, but whose actions were so audacious they reshaped the very map of the ancient world. The year was 221 BC, and for the first time in history, the warring states of China bowed to a single ruler, Qin Shi Huang, the man who would forge an empire from blood and bronze. His name alone conjures images of silent terracotta legions standing guard in the underworld, but those clay soldiers are just the beginning of his mysteries. Behind the Great Wall and standardized script we remember today lurked a ruler so consumed by the fear of death that he poisoned himself chasing eternity. This was no ordinary king. This was a man who rewrote the rules of power, then buried the truth where no one could find it. Consider the scale of his ambition. Before Qin Shi Huang, China was fractured into 7 kingdoms locked in endless war. He didn't just conquer them, he erased their identities, burning books and executing scholars to unify thought under his vision. Weights, measurements, even the axles of carts were standardized to his decree. But beneath this veneer of control simmered a terror that shaped his reign, the certainty that his enemies, both mortal and supernatural, were plotting his downfall. His palaces had hidden tunnels. He never slept in the same room twice. And then there were the elixirs. Court alchemists fed him pills laced with mercury, promising immortality. Instead, they accelerated his descent into madness. Ancient texts describe a ruler increasingly erratic, his paranoia growing with each dose. Was it the poison that fueled his ruthlessness? Or was the quest for eternal life merely the obsession of a man who'd already achieved the impossible? Then came the tomb. While Egypt's pharaohs built pyramids to touch the heavens, Qin Shi Huang dug downward, creating a subterranean empire guarded by 8,000 terracotta warriors, each with unique faces, as if he'd commissioned an army of ghosts. But the real enigma lies deeper. Sima Qian, the grand historian of ancient China, wrote of mercury rivers flowing through the burial chamber, mimicking the Yellow and Yangtze. Modern scans confirm alarming levels of the toxic metal in the soil, yet no one has dared open the tomb. Is it fear of the emperor's curse, the logistical nightmare of preserving what lies inside? Or something darker, the suspicion that some secrets were meant to stay buried? Perhaps the greatest irony is that Qin Shi Huang's death triggered the very chaos he dreaded. His dynasty crumbled within years, his name reviled by scholars for centuries, but his legacy is inescapable. The word China itself derives from Qin. His walls became the bones of a nation, and those silent terracotta soldiers, they've outlasted every enemy he ever feared, standing watch over a truth we may never fully uncover. Was he a visionary or a tyrant? The answer, like his tomb, remains sealed beneath layers of earth and legend. And if you think that's the last of history's buried secrets, prepare to meet a monarch whose very existence was erased until a single clue cracked open a conspiracy centuries in the making. The desert wind howled like a wounded beast as Cambyses II, King of Kings, stumbled through the sands, his empire slipping through his fingers grain by grain. This was the man who had crushed Egypt beneath his heel, yet now found himself hunted by shadows, his name whispered with fear and disgust. History remembers him as the Mad Persian, the tyrant who stabbed the sacred Apis bull and laughed as its blood soaked the temples of Memphis. But what if that's not the whole story? What if Cambyses was neither monster nor lunatic, but a victim of something far more dangerous, the vengeance of priests with pens? Let's rewind to his greatest triumph, the conquest of Egypt in 525 BC. Cambyses didn't just defeat Pharaoh Psamtik III, he humiliated him, using psychological warfare so brutal it still chills the spine. When the captured pharaoh's daughter was paraded in slave's garb, Psamtik wept. Cambyses' response: he ordered the son executed next, forcing the broken king to watch while his face remained dry. "Now you weep no more," the Persian reportedly sneered. It was a display of calculated cruelty, yes, but also a message to the world: resistance was futile. Yet something shifted after this victory. The once shrewd strategist began acting erratically. He ordered armies into the desert to sack the oracle of Ammon, only for 50,000 men to vanish without a trace. He mocked Egyptian gods, defied their rituals, and allegedly murdered the Apis bull, an act so sacrilegious it guaranteed the hatred of an entire nation. But here's the catch: the only accounts we have of these atrocities come from Egyptian priests, the very people who stood to lose power under Persian rule. Modern archaeology paints a murkier picture. The Apis bull's burial records show it died of natural causes months before Cambyses supposedly stabbed it. Temples he's accused of burning show no signs of damage from his reign. Even the mad military campaigns might have been logical. The lost army likely perished in a sandstorm, a common hazard, not divine wrath. So why the smear campaign? Because history is written by the survivors. When Cambyses rushed home to quell a rebellion in 522 BC, his death en route became fertile ground for legend. Some say he tripped on his own sword, a fitting end for a fool. Others whisper of assassination by his brother, the usurper Darius, but Egyptian chronicles insist the gods struck him down for his hubris. The truth may lie in the silence. Cambyses ruled at the dawn of empire, where religion and politics were inseparable. By challenging priestly authority, he didn't just commit blasphemy, he threatened the machinery of control. And so his legacy was rewritten, his sanity questioned, his victories overshadowed by tales of delirium. Perhaps the real madness wasn't in the king's actions, but in a system that could only explain defiance as insanity. After all, it's far easier to dismiss a heretic than to admit he might have been right. And if you think that's a conspiracy, wait until you hear about the next ruler, a monarch whose very existence was erased so thoroughly that historians debated for centuries whether they were fact or fiction. The statues showed a ruler with a pharaoh's traditional false beard and muscular torso, yet the lips curved with a subtle softness, the eyes holding secrets no chisel could erase. This was Hatshepsut, the woman who dared to become king in an empire where divinity flowed only through the blood of men. Imagine the audacity it took to stand before the gods and mortals alike, wrapped not in the linen of queens but in the regalia of rulers, proclaiming herself the rightful heir to Egypt's throne. But here's the twist: her reign wasn't one of rebellion. It was a masterclass in reinvention, a delicate dance between power and perception that would leave historians puzzled for millennia. She began as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, a boy king too small to wear the double crown. But as years passed, something extraordinary happened. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahri tell the story. Hatshepsut's image gradually shifted. The flowing gowns tightened into a king's kilt. the feminine titles vanished, replaced by the five-fold titulary of a pharaoh. Even her name was tweaked. Hatshepsut, meaning foremost of noble ladies, became Hatshepsut, a genderless echo. Was this deception, survival, or something far more profound? The answer might lie in her greatest monument, a terraced temple carved into the cliffs of western Thebes. Here, she didn't just erase her femininity, she rewrote her origin. Wall after wall proclaimed her divine birth, the god Ammon himself whispering to her mother that this child would rule all that the sun encircles. The message was clear: Hatshepsut wasn't usurping the throne. She was born for it, yet for all her brilliance, her name was scraped from history within decades of her death. Statues were smashed, cartouches defaced, her obelisk shrouded in stone. For years, scholars assumed this was the rage of Thutmose III, finally free to punish the stepmother who'd stolen his crown. But the truth is far stranger. The erasure began late in his reign, 20 years after her death. If this was vengeance, why wait? Perhaps because Thutmose wasn't destroying her legacy. He was safeguarding it. By removing a female king from the records, he wasn't erasing history. He was restoring Maat, the cosmic order disrupted by her rule. Or maybe the answer lies in that modest tomb in KV60, where her mummy was found not in a queen's splendor, but in the burial of her wet nurse. A pharaoh denied a pharaoh's rest. Then came the century's greatest detective story. In 2007, a single tooth sealed her fate. DNA matched it to a mummy long dismissed as insignificant, a woman with her arms crossed not in the royal posture, but in the gentle curve of a noblewoman. The pose was wrong, the location was wrong, everything was wrong except the tooth. Here, finally, was Hatshepsut, not entombed as a king, but hidden as something else entirely. So who was she truly? A visionary who bent tradition to her will, or a cautionary tale of ambition's price? The temples whisper one answer, the tombs another. And the truth, it lies somewhere in the shadows between. Now, prepare to meet a ruler whose story twists in the opposite direction. A king whose monuments were meant to last forever, only to be swallowed by the jungle as if the earth itself rejected his legacy. Gold flowed like water in the court of Croesus, last king of Lydia, so much that even today we say, rich as Croesus, without remembering the man behind the legend. But here's the truth they don't tell you. His story isn't about wealth. It's about the moment a king's certainty collided with the slippery nature of destiny. Picture Sardis in the 6th century BC, its streets glittering with electrum, its palaces draped in purple. Croesus didn't just rule, he transformed Lydia into the world's first economic superpower, minting coins that standardized trade from Greece to Persia. Yet for all his gold, he craved one thing money couldn't buy: assurance. And that's where the oracle's words slithered into history like a snake in a treasure vault. The Delphic prophecy was simple, or so it seemed. When Croesus asked whether to attack Persia, the priestess replied, "If you cross the Halys River, a great empire will fall." What ruler wouldn't hear confirmation in those words? But empires, like oracles, have two faces. Croesus's army marched east, certain of victory, only to watch his own kingdom crumble beneath Cyrus the Great's forces. The river he crossed became the border of his ruin. So was this divine trickery, or had the king, in his arrogance, forgotten that pride blinds before it breaks? Herodotus paints him as a tragic figure, spared from execution only when Cyrus heard him whisper Solon's warning. No man can be called happy until he knows how his story ends. Yet archaeology hints at a darker irony. Recent digs at Sardis reveal something startling. Lydia's famed gold reserves were running dry. Croesus's wars weren't just ambition, they were desperation. The coins that made his name were debased with silver near the end. Even the oracle's famous reply might have been a nudge toward restraint, not war. The Greek word empire didn't specify which one, but kings, like all mortals, hear what they wish to hear, and so Croesus's legacy twisted into paradox. The man who symbolized wealth became a warning against its illusions. The ruler who sought certainty learned that fate laughs at plans. His name still means riches, but his story whispers the oldest truth of all. Fortune is a fickle god, and the richest are often poorest in wisdom. Now turn your gaze to a monarch whose story inverts Croesus's, a ruler who lost everything but gained immortality in the strangest way imaginable. The golden domes of Topkapi Palace shimmered under the Istanbul sun, but behind the gilded walls, shadows stretched long in the court of Suleiman the Magnificent. Here was a ruler whose very name evoked grandeur, conqueror of Belgrade, patron of the arts, architect of a legal code, so just they called him the Lawgiver. Yet his legacy holds a paradox. How did history's most powerful sultan become ensnared in a web of whispers, his final years dictated not by sword or scripture, but by the ambitions of a woman who entered his life as a slave? Roxelana's rise reads like a fairy tale spun into a thriller. Captured in Ruthenia and sold to the imperial harem, she shattered centuries of tradition simply by making Suleiman fall in love. Ottoman sultans didn't marry, they took consorts, but Roxelana Hurrem, as the Turks called her, became his legal wife, a seismic shift that sent shockwaves through the empire. Courtiers gasped as she moved from the harem's seclusion to a palace of her own, corresponding with foreign monarchs and influencing policy. Was this true partnership or something darker? The clues lie in the bodies left in her wake. First came the strangling of Suleiman's favorite, the brilliant Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, once the Sultan's closest friend. Then the execution of Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son, by another woman, a golden prince so beloved that his death sparked revolts across Anatolia. Venetian ambassadors wrote of Roxelana's serpentine grace, hinting she'd convinced Suleiman that Mustafa plotted treason. But was the Sultan truly deceived, or did he sacrifice his son to secure the throne for Roxelana's children? The answer may lie in a macabre detail. When Mustafa entered his father's tent for their fatal meeting, he found not the Sultan, but 7 mute executioners. A king's judgment or a queen's revenge, even Roxelana's architectural philanthropy hides layers. The bathhouses and mosques she built were acts of piety, but their locations weren't random. Her complexes strategically bordered those of her rivals, as if to overshadow their legacies in stone. And then there's the haunting absence in Suleiman's final poems. Once filled with passion for Hurrem, they shift abruptly to lamentations for Mustafa after her death, a guilty conscience or proof that the Sultan, for all his power, was merely a player in someone else's game. The palace walls never gave up their secrets. Roxelana died 8 years before Suleiman, leaving their son Selim to inherit an empire already straining at the seams. Some say the Lawgiver's greatness died with her. Others claim she was the poison that corroded his judgment. But perhaps the truth is simpler. In a world where love and power shared a blade's edge, even the magnificent couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The Nile flowed backward the day Taharka marched into Memphis, or so the priests of Ammon claimed when the first black pharaoh in centuries took the throne. Here was a ruler who defied geography and expectation, a son of Cush who didn't just conquer Egypt but wore its double crown with a conviction that shook the ancient world. Picture the scene, a Nubian king standing where Ramses and Tutankhamun once stood, his skin darker than the fertile silt of the delta, his armies stretching from Sudan's golden deserts to the Mediterranean's blue horizon. But Taharka's reign wasn't just about power. It was a collision of faith, steel, and a mystery that still lingers in the ruins of his pyramids. His rise was nothing short of divine theater. Born in Napata, the spiritual heart of Kush, Taharka was raised in the shadow of Jebel Barkal, the sacred mountain believed to house Ammon himself. By 20, he'd fought alongside his uncle Pi to reclaim Egypt from fracturing Libyan dynasties. But where Pi had been a conqueror, Taharka became a convert. He didn't just rule Egypt, he embraced it, restoring temples from Thebes to Tanis with an almost obsessive reverence. At Karnak, his face stares down from reliefs, Nubian features carved beside hieroglyphs proclaiming him beloved of Ammon. Was this genuine devotion or political theater to legitimize a foreign ruler? The answer might lie in his strangest campaign, not against armies, but against a lion. Ancient texts describe Taharka single-handedly slaying a lioness in the desert, an act symbolizing his taming of chaos. But here's the twist. Assyrian records claim he fled that same desert years later when their king, Esarhaddon, invaded. The discrepancy cuts to the heart of Taharka's enigma. Was he a warrior king undone by overconfidence, or a pragmatist who knew when to retreat? The Assyrians certainly painted him as cowardly, boasting how they chased him like a fox through the reeds. Yet Egypt's southern frontier tells another story. Taharka's engineers built fortresses at Buhan and Semna so formidable that even the Assyrians hesitated to pursue him into the Nubian heartland. And then there's the greatest clue of all, his sudden returns. Twice Taharka lost Egypt to Assyria. Twice he clawed it back, exploiting their overstretched supply lines and local resentment. His strategy was less about brute force than endurance, a chess master willing to lose pawns to save the king. But his final retreat to Kush holds the darkest mystery. Did he abandon Egypt to protect his homeland, or was he driven out by something worse than armies, perhaps the very gods he'd spent his life worshipping? A stela at Tanis hints at a plague ravaging his troops, a breath of Set that turned victory to ash. Today, Taharka's legacy sleeps beneath the sands of Nuri, where his pyramid rises steeper and narrower than Egypt's, a deliberate defiance of tradition. Inside, archaeologists found not gold but something more telling, a statue of the pharaoh as a sphinx, his Nubian features fused with the lion's body, forever guarding the border between two worlds. Perhaps that's the real story, not a king who failed, but one who refused to be defined by borders, his name echoing where the desert meets the river, where history still wrestles with the weight of his crown. Now turn your gaze to a monarch whose reign burned bright and brief, a ruler who didn't just defend his kingdom but redefined what it meant to rule, only to vanish in a blaze of unanswered questions. The walls of Jerusalem trembled as Babylonian siege engines pounded the gates, but inside his palace, Zedekiah, last king of Judah, faced a torment far worse than the sounds of war. Here was a ruler caught between faith and futility, his every decision etched with the knowledge that his ancestors' mistakes were about to become his apocalypse. The prophet Jeremiah had warned him for years, submit to Nebuchadnezzar or watch the temple burn. Yet when the moment came, Zedekiah chose defiance, a choice that would leave his name synonymous with tragedy. But was this really blind stubbornness, or did he see something modern historians often miss, that surrender might have doomed Judah just as surely as rebellion? Let's peel back the layers. Zedekiah wasn't born to rule. He was the uncle of Judah's previous king, Jehoiachin, installed by Nebuchadnezzar himself after Babylon's first sack of Jerusalem in 597 BC. His very name, meaning "Yahweh is my righteousness," was a political statement, Babylon's way of signaling a fresh start. For years, he played the obedient vassal, sending tribute east while Jeremiah's scrolls condemned such compliance as cowardice. Then came Egypt's whispers. Pharaoh Hafra dangled promises of military support, igniting hope in Jerusalem's courtiers that the old alliance could break Babylon's grip. Zedekiah hesitated, weighing prophetic warnings against the desperate calculus of survival. When he finally rebelled in 588 BC, it wasn't with the zeal of a fanatic, but the grim resolve of a man out of options. What followed was 18 months of horror. Babylonian troops encircled the city, building siege ramps so high they shadowed the temple walls. Inside, starvation turned nobles to thieves and mothers to monsters. The Book of Lamentations describes women boiling their own children for food. Yet Zedekiah held out, perhaps hoping Egypt's armies would materialize as promised. They never came. When the walls finally crumbled in 586, the king fled through a midnight tunnel with his sons, only to be captured in the plains near Jericho. The punishment was biblical in its cruelty. Nebuchadnezzar made him watch as his heirs were executed, then gouged out his eyes so the slaughter would be his last living memory. In chains, blind and broken, he was dragged to Babylon, where he died in obscurity. But the real mystery isn't his suffering, it's why he risked everything. Archaeology offers a chilling clue. Excavations at Lachish and Azekah reveal a network of signal fires between Judah's cities, proof of coordinated resistance. Zedekiah wasn't acting alone. His rebellion was a last stand by a people refusing to vanish. Even Jeremiah's prophecies hint at nuance. While he denounced the revolt, he also foretold Babylon's eventual fall, suggesting Yahweh's plan was bigger than any one king's obedience. Perhaps Zedekiah saw himself not as defying divine will, but fulfilling it through sacrifice. After all, his surrender might have spared Jerusalem's walls, but would it have saved Judah's soul? The ruins tell their own story. Nebuchadnezzar's troops burned the temple so thoroughly that the stones melted together, leaving a layer of blackened debris still visible today. Yet from this ashes rose an irony. The exile to Babylon didn't destroy Judaism, it reinvented it. Without a temple or a king, the people turned to scripture and synagogue, laying foundations that would outlast every empire. Zedekiah's failed gamble became the crucible for survival. His name means Yahweh is my righteousness, and in the end, that righteousness proved far more resilient than any crown. Now prepare to meet a ruler whose story flips this narrative, a monarch who didn't just lose his kingdom, but willed its destruction with a single, unfathomable command. The waves churned blood red at Salamis as 300 ships clashed in the narrow straits, but one vessel stood out not for its size or strength, but for the woman who commanded it. Artemisia of Caria, the only female admiral in Xerxes' Persian fleet, didn't just fight like a queen, she fought like a predator. Ancient historians couldn't decide whether to condemn her or marvel at her. Herodotus, who normally reserved his highest praise for Greeks, called her the most courageous of all, while her own allies whispered that her loyalty was as fluid as the sea she ruled. So who was this woman who turned naval warfare into a psychological game? And why does her legend hinge on the most audacious bluff in military history? Artemisia's rise was improbable from the start. As ruler of Caria, a Greek-speaking region under Persian control, she inherited her throne after her husband's death, a rarity in a world where power almost always passed to men. But it was her grasp of the sea that caught Xerxes' eye. While other satraps offered infantry or gold, Artemisia brought warships crewed by sailors who'd known the Aegean's current since childhood. When the Persian king launched his invasion of Greece in 480 BC, she wasn't just invited to join. She stood at his right hand during strategic councils, the lone voice daring to challenge his admirals. And that's when the stories begin to twist. The Battle of Salamis should have been her end. Trapped in a chaotic melee, Artemisia's ship found itself cornered by Athenian triremes. What happened next depends on who you ask. Herodotus claims she ordered her crew to ram an allied vessel, flying Persian colors. As the ship sank, the Greeks, assuming she'd switched sides, cheered and let her pass. It was a masterstroke. Sacrifice one ally to save your own skin, all while convincing the enemy you're now their friend. Xerxes, watching from shore, reportedly exclaimed, "My men have become women and my women men." But was this brilliant tactics or cold-blooded betrayal? The answer might lie in the wreckage of a ship discovered near Salamis in 2016, its hull showing damage consistent with a deliberate ramming from a vessel of Carian design. Yet the greater mystery isn't what Artemisia did, but why she did it. Persian records suggest she warned Xerxes against engaging at Salamis, knowing the narrow waters favored Greek agility over Persian numbers. When he ignored her, did she engineer an escape to preserve Caria's autonomy? Or was this simply survival instinct from a ruler who understood the sea's ruthlessness better than any land-bound king? The aftermath hints at both. While Xerxes retreated to Asia, Artemisia's reputation only grew. Legends say she later advised him to abandon his conquests, whispering that his heir could always try again, advice so shrewd it spared Persia total collapse. Her legacy defies easy categories. To Athenians, she was a villainess. To Carians, a patriot who played both sides to protect her people. Modern scholars debate whether she was feminist icon or opportunist, but perhaps that's missing the point. Artemisia thrived in the gray zones between empires, between loyalties, even between truth and myth. The sea doesn't reward absolutes, and neither did she. In the end, her greatest tactic wasn't the ramming ship or the whispered counsel, but the way she made sure history would never pin her down. Now, turn the page to a ruler whose story couldn't be more different, a king who didn't navigate chaos like Artemisia, but unleashed it with a single, earth-shaking decision. Blood ran knee-deep in Kalinga's soil when Ashoka the Mauryan looked upon his handiwork, 100,000 slain, cities reduced to ash, rivers choked with corpses. This was no ordinary victory. It was the moment a conqueror became something else entirely. History knows Ashoka as the Buddhist king whose edicts preached compassion carved in stone, but those polished words hide a darker truth. They were written by a man who knew exactly how much violence it took to change the world. So what transformed this butcher of millions into history's most unexpected apostle of peace? The answer lies in the space between two versions of the same man, and the haunting question of whether his conversion was enlightenment or the ultimate political strategy. Consider the timeline of his metamorphosis. Before Kalinga in 261 BC, Ashoka was every inch his father's son, ruthless, ambitious, and willing to execute his own brothers to secure the throne. His armies stretched the Mauryan Empire from Afghanistan to Bengal, each conquest marked by the same brutal efficiency. Then came that fateful campaign against the independent kingdom of Kalinga, a tiny speck on India's eastern coast that refused to bow. The resistance was fiercer than expected. When the dust settled, the scale of suffering struck even Ashoka's hardened soul. Rock Edict 13 describes his reaction in startling detail. The beloved of the gods was overcome with remorse. What have I done? But here's what the inscriptions don't say. This epiphany took years. Ashoka didn't abandon war overnight. He spent months consolidating power before his first Buddhist edict appeared. Was this delay the mark of a genuine spiritual journey, or a ruler calculating how to rebrand himself? The evidence cuts both ways. On one hand, Ashoka's policies were revolutionary. He abolished animal sacrifices, built hospitals for humans and beasts alike, and sent missionaries as far as Egypt and Greece, all while etching his philosophies onto pillars and boulders across the subcontinent. These weren't hollow gestures. His rock edicts advised tolerance for all sects, from Jains to Ajavikas, a radical stance in an era when kings derived legitimacy from patronizing state religions. Yet skeptics point to convenient timing. Buddhism's emphasis on non-violence perfectly suited an empire strained by constant war. By championing Dharma moral law over the sword, Ashoka could maintain control without the cost of further rebellions. Even his famed animal protection laws had a practical edge, preserving elephants, the tanks of ancient warfare. Then there's the strangest clue of all, Ashoka's own words. In Minor Rock Edict 1, he confesses that progress toward enlightenment was slow, admitting, "It took more than 2.5 years for me to become an ardent Buddhist." This vulnerability is jarring from a man who once ordered mass executions. Perhaps the truth lies in the tension between these two Ashokas, the emperor who needed to project divine authority and the mortal who genuinely grappled with guilt. His later edicts grow increasingly personal, even describing how he replaced royal hunting trips with pilgrimages to sacred sites. The man who once measured power in territory conquered now boasted of wells dug and shade trees planted along trade routes. Modern archaeology adds another layer. At Sanoti in Karnataka, a recently discovered Ashokan edict contradicts the standard narrative, omitting all reference to Kalinga's remorse. Some scholars now suggest his conversion predated the war, that the bloodshed may have been less a turning point than a failure to live up to ideals he already held. If true, it paints an even more complex portrait, not a monster redeemed, but a conflicted ruler who slipped backward into violence before recommitting to peace. Whatever his motives, the results were undeniable. Ashoka's reign became the gold standard of Buddhist kingship, inspiring rulers from Sri Lanka to Japan. Yet after his death, the Mauryan Empire crumbled within decades, as if his experiment in ethical rule couldn't outlast the man himself. That may be the final irony. The king who rejected violence as policy ultimately proved how fragile peace can be, and how extraordinary it is to find its fingerprints on the hands of someone who once wielded absolute power. Now shift your gaze to a ruler whose story inverts Ashoka's, a monarch who began with ideals only to drown them in a tide of terror, proving that power can corrupt even the most promising of minds. The coins glittered under the African sun, each one stamped with a crescent moon, a symbol that whispered of a lost world. This was the currency of Cleopatra Selene, daughter of Egypt's most famous queen, but hers was no ordinary inheritance. When Octavian's legions overran Alexandria in 30 BC, her parents, Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, chose death over chains. Their orphaned children were paraded through Rome as trophies of war, the crowd's jeers still ringing in their ears. Yet somehow, against all odds, this exiled princess didn't just survive, she clawed her way back to power, becoming Queen of Mauritania and turning a Roman puppet state into a flourishing kingdom. How did a woman who began life as a prisoner rewrite her fate so spectacularly? The answer lies in a blend of diplomacy, defiance, and a quiet revolution hidden in plain sight. First, consider the impossible tightrope she walked. Mauritania, modern-day Morocco and Algeria, was Rome's client kingdom, its throne a gift from Octavian himself. On the surface, Selene's reign looked like surrender, a conquered princess playing house for her captors. But dig deeper and the picture shifts. She married Juba II, another royal hostage raised in Rome, but unlike so many political unions, this one crackled with partnership. Together, they transformed their capital, Caesarea, into a mirror of Alexandria, complete with marble palaces and a library stocked with Greek scrolls. Their court became a refuge for scholars and artists fleeing Rome's stifling orthodoxy. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was cultural resistance, a way to keep her mother's legacy alive under Rome's watchful gaze. Then there were the coins. Currency in the ancient world wasn't just money, it was propaganda. Selene's bore the crescent moon of her namesake goddess, a nod to her mother's claim of descent from Isis. More daringly, some issues showed her face alone without jewels, a rarity for any queen of the era. Even Cleopatra VII had shared her coins with Antony. But Selene's boldest move was subtler. She revived the Ptolemaic tradition of dating her reign from her parents' deaths, not her coronation. To Rome, it looked like harmless pageantry. To those who understood the code, it declared her the true heir of Egypt's last pharaohs. Yet her greatest triumph was turning Mauritania into an economic powerhouse. While Rome squeezed Egypt dry, Selene's kingdom flourished, its fields yielding grain, its mines spilling silver and purple dye. She even recreated her mother's snake and basilisk perfume trade, shipping flasks of the coveted scent to Roman aristocrats who'd once cheered her downfall. The irony must have been delicious, the daughter of the woman they demonized now supplying their luxuries. When Selene died around 5 BC, she was buried in a tomb fit for a pharaoh, its location still a mystery. Rome erased her parents' memory, but Selene's legacy endured in the streets of Caesarea and the faces of her descendants, who ruled Mauritania until Caligula's madness tore it apart. Her story isn't one of revenge or rebellion, but of something far more subversive, a woman who used the tools of the conqueror to rebuild what they destroyed, proving that some dynasties don't end with a sword, but with a whispered promise carried on the wind. Now, journey to a ruler whose story defies even this, a king who didn't just lose his throne, but willingly stepped into the shadows, leaving behind a mystery that still haunts historians today. The imperial purple draped awkwardly over his small shoulders, a boy of barely 12 summers, suddenly the most powerless emperor in history. Romulus Augustulus never stood a chance. By the time he was proclaimed ruler in 475 AD, the Western Roman Empire had been gutted like a fish, its organs Spain, Africa, Gaul already carved away by Germanic kings. His very name was a cruel joke, Romulus after Rome's mythical founder, and Augustulus, Little Augustus, a mocking echo of the empire's first golden emperor. For less than a year, he sat on a throne that controlled little beyond Italy's borders, a puppet whose strings were pulled by his father, the General Orsts. Then the barbarians at the gate became the barbarians in the palace. Odoacer, commander of the Germanic Foederati, made his demand simple: land for his troops. When Orsts refused, the revolt was swift and brutal. By August 476, Odoacer's forces had executed Orsts and marched into Ravenna, where young Romulus was said to be practicing his letters. What happened next should have been a massacre, the end of a dynasty. Instead, it became one of history's strangest acts of mercy. Odoacer, perhaps moved by the boy's youth or sensing the symbolism of sparing the last emperor, exiled him to a villa in Campania with an annual pension. The imperial regalia was packed up and sent east to Constantinople, a tacit admission that there would never be another Western Roman emperor. But here's where the mystery thickens. Romulus didn't just fade away, he vanished. No chronicler recorded his death. No tombstone bears his name. Some medieval sources claim he lived quietly into his 40s, even corresponding with Eastern emperors about restoring his title. A 9th century historian wrote of a certain Romulus visiting Constantinople during Justinian's reign, though whether this was the deposed boy king or an impostor is anyone's guess. The most tantalizing clue comes from the ruins of Lucullus Villa near Naples, where an anonymous nobleman was buried around 510 AD with neither fanfare nor inscription, just a single coin of the Western Empire tucked beneath his ribs. Was this deliberate erasure or mere neglect? The Eastern Empire, busy pretending the West could still be reclaimed, had no interest in memorializing its failure. Odoacer, now ruling Italy as a client king, couldn't risk martyring the last legitimate heir. Even the church stayed silent, perhaps wary of antagonizing their new Germanic overlords. So Romulus became a ghost emperor, his fate as shadowed as the twilight of the civilization he briefly embodied. Yet his legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. The date of his deposition, September 4, 476, is often cited as the fall of Rome, though the East endured another 1,000 years. More haunting is the parallel to his namesake, Romulus the Founder, who also disappeared mysteriously, leaving behind only legends. Perhaps that's the final irony. The empire that began with a vanished king ended with one too, a boy who stepped off history's stage so quietly, we're still straining to hear his footsteps. Now turn your gaze to a ruler whose disappearance was anything but quiet, a monarch who didn't fade into obscurity, but staged his own vanishing act with the flair of a master illusionist. The feathered serpent stirred in its temple as Montezuma II gazed across Lake Texcoco, his city of Tenochtitlan shimmering like a mirage of gold and obsidian. No ruler in the Americas commanded such wealth or terror. His empire stretched from coast to jungle, its tribute system funneling jaguar pelts, cocoa beans, and precious metals into a capital so grand, Spanish chroniclers later claimed its temples rivaled Venice in splendor. Yet for all his power, Montezuma's name would become synonymous with a single, catastrophic moment: the day he welcomed Hernan Cortés into his throne room, sealing the Aztec Empire's fate. But what transpired in those critical hours wasn't mere naivety. It was a collision of two worlds, each viewing the other through a lens of divine prophecy and mortal error. Consider the timing. When Cortés landed in 1519, Aztec astrologers had already warned of omens, comets splitting the night sky, temples bursting into unexplained flames. For a ruler steeped in cyclical cosmology, where history repeated in 52-year cycles, these signs pointed to one possibility: the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who'd vowed to reclaim his kingdom. Cortés, with his pale skin and strange ships, fit the prophecy's description uncannily. Montezuma's initial hesitation wasn't cowardice. It was the agonizing calculus of a king balancing earthly power against celestial will. He sent emissaries bearing gold not as tribute but as tests. When the Spaniards melted sacred artifacts into ingots, the truth should have been clear. Yet still he hesitated. The deeper mystery lies in what happened next. For weeks, Montezuma hosted Cortés in his palace, allowing the conquistador to study Aztec defenses, even gifting him a map of the empire's gold mines. Some historians argue this was strategy, an attempt to appease what he saw as divine guests until reinforcements arrived. Others cite indigenous accounts suggesting Montezuma was paralyzed by factional divides. His own nobles whispered that the Spaniards were mere mortals, while rebel city-states like Tlaxcala saw Cortés as a weapon to break Aztec dominance. By the time Montezuma ordered an ambush at Colula, it was too late. Cortés, tipped off by his Tlaxcalan allies, struck first. The fall of Tenochtitlan wasn't instantaneous. Montezuma's death, whether by Spanish hands or his own people's stones, triggered a year of brutal fighting, but the seeds of collapse were sown in those early days of hesitation. Modern excavations beneath Mexico City reveal the scale of loss. melted gold ornaments mixed with the bones of smallpox victims, their DNA telling of a population decimated by European diseases before the final siege. The greatest tragedy may be that Montezuma wasn't entirely wrong about prophecy, just its meaning. The Spaniards did herald an ending, but not the one he'd envisioned. His empire didn't pass peacefully to returning gods. It was dismantled brick by brick, its libraries burned, its treasures shipped to Sevilla, yet fragments of his legacy endure. In a Mexico City cathedral, a stone disc hides beneath the altar, a recycled Aztec calendar stone, its carvings of Tanatia, the sun god, peeking through layers of whitewash. It's a fitting metaphor for Montezuma's reign, a civilization not erased but buried, waiting for the moment when history digs deep enough to see its true face. Now shift your gaze to a ruler whose story inverts this narrative, not an empire lost to outsiders, but one dismantled from within by a monarch's own unthinkable decree. The name alone struck terror into the hearts of monks clutching their Bibles in coastal monasteries: Ragnar Lodbrok, the Viking scourge whose legend was written in the blood of England and France. But here's the twist that's baffled historians for centuries. The man who supposedly fathered the great heathen army might never have existed as a single person at all. Imagine a shadow flickering between history and myth, a name so potent it became a vessel for every fearsome Norse raid of the 9th century. Was Ragnar a flesh and blood warlord whose deeds inspired sagas, or a clever fusion of multiple warriors, their exploits stitched together by skalds hungry for a hero? The answer lies somewhere in the silence between chronicles and the echoes of epic poetry. Start with the contradictory sources. Frankish annals describe a Viking leader named Reginhurus sacking Paris in 845, a man who demanded 2.5 tons of silver to spare the city, then broke his word and pillaged anyway. Sounds like Ragnar, right? But Icelandic sagas, written centuries later, paint a far grander picture. A king who wore magical, boiled leather pants to slay dragons, a lover who wooed a shield maiden by surviving a pit of snakes, a father whose sons wept tears of blood when they heard of his death. These aren't just embellishments, they're the fingerprints of oral tradition where history bends to the rhythm of a good story. Even his nickname, Lodbrok, meaning hairy breeches, feels less like a title and more like a bard's flourish. Then there's the matter of timing. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865, led by warriors claiming to avenge Ragnar's death, fits neatly with the saga of a legendary father. But dig deeper and the math unravels. If Ragnar was active in the early 9th century, as some accounts suggest, he'd have been impossibly old to father sons leading armies decades later. Unless, of course, Ragnar was a mantle passed down, a brand as much as a man. Consider this: Viking bands often operated independently, their leaders adopting similar names to invoke shared prestige. Could multiple sea kings have become conflated into one superhuman figure, their collective violence distilled into a single, unforgettable name? The archaeological record adds another layer of intrigue. No burial definitively linked to Ragnar has ever been found, though the mass grave at Repton in England, filled with Viking warriors and bearing signs of ritual dismemberment, is often tied to the great heathen army. The bones whisper of violence, but they don't name names. Meanwhile, Norse runestones mention sons like Ivar the Boneless and Björn Ironside, but their connection to Ragnar is implied rather than proven. It's as if history left us a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces borrowed from mythology. Perhaps the most compelling clue lies in what the stories do agree on. Whether real or composite, Ragnar's legend served a purpose. To the Vikings, he embodied the ideal of relentless ambition, a man who dared to sail farther, fight harder, and defy kings until his brutal end said to be execution in a Northumbrian snake pit. To Christian chroniclers, he became the archetype of pagan savagery, a warning of divine punishment for the sinful, and to his alleged sons, whether biological or symbolic, their vengeance campaign reshaped England's map, carving out the Danelaw and proving that even if Ragnar was myth, his legacy was undeniable. So does it matter if Ragnar was one man or many? In a way, the question misses the point. The Vikings didn't distinguish between history and legend the way we do. For them, a story's power lay in its truthfulness to spirit, not fact. Ragnar Lodbrok, whether flesh or fable, became the lightning rod for an era of fire and axes, a name that still burns brighter than the longboats he supposedly sailed. And that, in the end, is the real mystery, not whether he existed but why we keep needing him to. Now, turn your gaze to a ruler whose reality is unquestioned, but whose actions were so shocking they forced an empire to its knees, a monarch who didn't just break the rules but set them aflame. The wine flowed freely that night in Chenqiao, too freely, some might say, for what happened next would rewrite the destiny of an empire. Zhao Quanjian, the general known as the Dragon King for his imposing stature and fiery temper, awoke to find himself draped in the imperial yellow robe, his officers kneeling in the pre-dawn light. The official histories would later call this the Chenqiao Mutiny, a spontaneous act of divine providence where the heavens themselves chose a new ruler. But the scent of staged theater hangs thick over that night in 960. How convenient that the troops just happened to have an emperor's robe at hand. How fortuitous that Zhao's younger brother and closest advisors orchestrated the whole affair while he allegedly slept. This wasn't just a coup, it was a masterclass in political branding, wrapped in the silk of celestial legitimacy. Zhao's genius lay not in the takeover but in what came after. Where other usurpers relied on the sword, he wielded symbolism with razor precision. He didn't execute the child emperor he deposed. He pensioned him off with honors, a move that calmed the scholar elite. He didn't purge the military aristocracy. He invited them to a banquet, got them drunk, and persuaded them to retire with generous land grants. The message was clear. Resistance was futile, but cooperation would be rewarded. His cup of wine strategy became legendary, dismantling the warlord system that had plagued China for centuries without spilling a drop of blood, at least not in public. Behind the scenes, the story darkens. Regional governors who refused his offers mysteriously died. Rival generals found themselves reassigned to mosquito-infested border posts. The Dragon King's velvet glove hid an iron fist. Then came the reforms that would echo through a millennium. Zhao Quanjian didn't just found the Song dynasty, he built its DNA. By separating military and civilian authority, he neutered the warlordism that had toppled previous regimes. He expanded the civil service exams, creating a meritocracy that drew talent from all social strata. His economic policies standardized currency. State-controlled trade fueled an economic boom that made Song China the wealthiest society on earth. But his most radical innovation was cultural, the idea that scholars, not warriors, should sit at the empire's apex. For the first time, a Chinese ruler elevated poets and philosophers above generals, setting a template that would last until the 20th century. Was this vision or pragmatism? The answer might lie in his own past. Zhao had risen through military ranks. He knew better than anyone how dangerous unchecked warlords could be. Yet for all his statecraft, Zhao's death remains one of history's coldest cases. The official record claims he died at 50 from natural causes after summoning his brother, Zhao Quanji, for a private talk. But court whispers told a different story of a night spent arguing, of raised voices, then silence. By morning, the Dragon King was dead and Quanji sat on the throne. The historian Sima Guang, writing a century later, dropped tantalizing hints about an axe incident in the bedchamber, a detail so specific it reeks of suppressed truth. Modern scholars still debate whether this was fratricide or merely convenient timing. What's undeniable is the irony. The man who perfected the bloodless coup may have fallen to one himself. Zhao Quanjin's legacy is a hall of mirrors. He gave China stability and prosperity but entrenched systems that would later leave it vulnerable to Mongol conquest. He preached Confucian virtue while allegedly scheming his way to power. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the Dragon King, that in the Game of Thrones, even the most enlightened rulers must sometimes dance with shadows. His reign proves that history's most enduring empires aren't built on purity, but on the careful balance of idealism and realpolitik, where every golden age has its origin story polished just enough to hide the fingerprints. The golden bangle slipped from her wrist as Cleopatra reached for the fig basket, a careless detail that would echo through millennia. History remembers her death in 30 BC as the final act of a tragic love story, the last pharaoh of Egypt lying on a gilded couch as the venom of an asp coursed through her veins. But peel back the layers of Roman propaganda, and the truth becomes as elusive as the location of her lost tomb. Was it really a snakebite that claimed her, or something far more calculated? The answer lies in the intersection of ancient biases, scientific skepticism, and a queen who knew her legacy would be written by her enemies. Start with the Roman version, immortalized by poets like Virgil and historians like Plutarch. In their telling, Cleopatra chose death over humiliation, applying the serpent to her arm rather than suffer the disgrace of being paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph. It's a gripping tale, one that paints her as both femme fatale and noble martyr, but the logistics unravel under scrutiny. An Egyptian asp or cobra is nearly 6 feet long. Smuggling one into a heavily guarded palace would have been improbable, let alone discreet. Even if she'd managed it, cobra venom induces a slow, agonizing death marked by vomiting and convulsions, hardly the serene exit described. Modern toxicologists suggest she more likely drank a lethal cocktail of opium, hemlock, and wolfsbane, a mixture known to Egyptian physicians as the drink of the merciful gods. Then there's the political theater of it all. Octavian had every reason to embellish the snake story. A suicide by venomous serpent played better to the Roman crowd than a mere poisoning. It smacked of exoticism and divine punishment. More importantly, it absolved him of responsibility. If Cleopatra died by her own hand, he couldn't be accused of executing a woman, a taboo even for conquerors, or mishandling his prized captive. The asp narrative also subtly reinforced his propaganda. Egyptians were irrational, theatrical, prone to animal worship. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's real weapon, her intellect, faded into the background. Because let's be clear, this was no love-struck adolescent. Fluent in 9 languages, the author of medical and alchemical texts, she was the first Ptolemy in 3 centuries to bother learning Egyptian. Her famed liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just romantic entanglements, they were strategic alliances to preserve Egypt's independence from Rome. Even in her final hours, she was conducting negotiations with Octavian, angling to secure her children's futures. That's why the lost tomb matters. Burial sites were passports to the afterlife in Egyptian belief, and Cleopatra would have planned hers meticulously. Some archaeologists speculate it lies beneath Taposiris Magna, a temple near Alexandria where a team recently uncovered a tunnel leading to a submerged chamber. Others believe it's hidden in the palace district, now underwater due to ancient earthquakes. The irony, Cleopatra's greatest fear was being forgotten. Instead, she became history's most famous woman, just not in the way she'd hoped. Roman poets reduced her to a cautionary tale about dangerous women, while Hollywood cemented the image of her lounging on a barge. The real tragedy isn't how she died, but how we've let her enemies define her. Because somewhere beneath the Mediterranean's blue expanse, a tomb may still hold the truth, not about snakes or suicides, but about a queen who outsmarted empires until the very end. From erased pharaohs to vanished queens, these rulers remind us that history isn't just written. It's painted over, scraped clean, and rewritten with every changing dynasty. The victors may hold the brushes, but the cracks in their narratives always show through. Think about Akhenaten's sun-worshipping revolution, deleted from temple walls by those who came after him. Or Hatshepsut, her statues defaced not in anger, but as a quiet correction to restore what her society saw as divine order. Even Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor who disappeared without a tombstone, proves how fragile power becomes when the world decides to look away. These aren't just gaps in the historical record, they're invitations. Every chisel mark obscuring a queen's name, every contradictory account of a battle, every lost tomb is really a door waiting to be opened. Take Boudica's missing grave or Sheba's elusive kingdom. Their physical absence somehow makes their legends louder, turning archaeologists into detectives and historians into storytellers. Because here's the truth no textbook will admit. Mystery is what keeps history alive. We don't debate the weather patterns of ancient Babylon, but we'll argue for hours about whether Nero really fiddled while Rome burned. Uncertainty is the spark that makes the past feel urgent, personal. And that's the real magic of these rulers. They force us to confront how much we don't and can't know. The terracotta army standing guard over Qin Shi Huang's Mercury rivers, the whispered rumors about Artemisia's naval deception, the eerie parallels between Ragnar's mythical sons and real Viking warlords, they all blur the line between fact and folklore in ways that challenge our modern obsession with neat answers. Maybe that's why their stories endure. In a world of algorithms and instant information, ancient mysteries remind us that some questions are meant to linger, that the pursuit can be as thrilling as the solution. So which ruler's shadow lingers in your imagination? The heretic pharaoh who gambled everything on one god, the queen who turned exile into empire, or the conqueror who built peace from his own remorse? Drop your favorite below, and remember, for every mystery we've explored today, there are 100 more waiting in the ruins. Hit subscribe, because this journey through history's hidden corridors, it's only just begun.